This is Scott Becker with the Becker Private Equity Podcast, the Becker Business Minute Podcast. We're speaking today with Andrea Lee Linna, a partner at McGuireWoods, and we're really going to talk about this new FTC proposal that would ban non-competes and what that kind of might mean for private equity funds investing in businesses or in practices, health systems investing in practices or businesses. Andrea, can you take a moment and introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Well, thanks, Scott. Like you mentioned, I work with digital health companies really across the spectrum in the legal space. So on mergers and acquisitions, regulatory compliance, data privacy, and so work with them on like their telehealth programs, the remote patient monitoring, wearables, HIPAA, healthcare IT. And so I'm based in McGuireWoods Chicago office and help lead our digital health technology and innovation group.
Thank you. And when you look at digital health and innovation, what are some of the most interesting stories or issues that you're watching currently as we head into 2023?
Yeah, so two interesting stories from a legal perspective now that we're heading into 2023 are the first, which is hot topic across all industries, and I'm sure you've already talked to some people about this, is the FTC proposed ban on non-competes. So this was earlier this month, so that'll be January 2023, the FTC came out with a proposed rule saying that it was going to potentially ban all non-competes agreements between employers and workers in most circumstances, and then also require employers to rescind any existing non-compete agreements. So as background, non-competes are typically part of a contract in healthcare with a physician or a nurse practitioner or some healthcare executive that prevents the individual from taking a job in a competing area or competing job elsewhere, maybe in a certain geographic area or for a certain period of time. And the idea behind this for the companies is, hey, we've provided a lot of resources and capital, and we've trained you, and we've provided you all of this information, and we don't want you to be able to leave and then go take it to our competitors and what they believe is unfairly competing against them because you're using their information against them. The FTC is basically saying that isn't right, that isn't fair for most workers, and that's prohibiting workers from taking different jobs, starting their own businesses, etc. And this is a proposed rule by the FTC, so it is not final. And I anticipate, and I think most people anticipate, lawsuits and lots of dialogue about this before it does become final, if it does. But really important to pay attention to now for any healthcare company, but I think digital health companies calling that out specifically because it's such a fast-paced changing environment, and that's where these non-competes are so important, right? Is if you're saying, oh, we've got these great new ideas, we're the Amazon of healthcare, right? We don't want you taking our ideas to our competitor. So dear, healthcare executive, we're going to have you not compete for a year or 2 years after your employment with us. So I think it's a really important thing to know is coming, potentially, to monitor it and to think about how you're using non-competes today and what would happen if you couldn't use those anymore, and what are some other strategies in thinking about that. So like I said, not final, proposed rule, but still super interesting and would be a huge shift for many healthcare companies.
And let me ask you a question, because there's different types of non-competes. For example, when a hospital hires a physician directly, he or she might have a non-compete, but the hospital's not necessarily bought assets from that physician. They didn't buy the practice from that physician. So hospitals might get much more comfortable, particularly if there's not big upfront payments, in having a physician hired that doesn't have a non-compete. Physicians are free to go across the street, and so forth and so on. In contrast, sometimes physician practices are bought either by a private equity fund or a health system, and then there's a non-compete attached to that acquisition. Typically, there's two kinds of non-compete. You buy the practice, and for 3 to 5 years after you bought the practice, the physicians can't practice within a certain radius or mileage area. And there's also a second non-compete that goes with the employment agreement that says for a couple years after leaving employment, or you're leaving employment, the physician can't practice. Similarly, in surgery center partnerships, when a physician invests in a surgery center, typically there's a non-compete that says that physician can't invest in another surgery center within 10, 20 miles or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a distinction in the FTC's language so far about employment covenants versus joint venture covenants or acquisition covenants, or right now it's too early to tell what it means for all these different things?
Yeah, I think they have some language in there about they're considering an exception for the acquisition concept if the individual was like a 25% owner, I think, or there was some threshold. We'll see what happens with that. I think the commentary has been, okay, that's great, but that still doesn't necessarily help us if we've got that 25% threshold. And generally, the commentary is the FTC has said in its proposed rule, it was considering, oh, do we want this to only apply to hourly workers, or do we want it to apply across the board, or et cetera, kind of those different carve-outs. So we'll see. I think they have explicitly called that out in the proposed rule. What will be interesting is there's 60 days in order for individuals or companies or trade associations or whatnot to make proposals and submit comments on the proposed rule. So I think after that happens, we'll have some really good information on where the pushback is here, and maybe some alternative suggestions like you're talking about, like, hey, these are two different worlds when we're talking about employment versus we're talking about you've acquired a company. And part of that acquisition value, right, comes from those non-competes. So that'd be a huge upset in those types of situations.
There's been a lot of the lawyers talking about this non-compete FTC issue a lot, and just starting to hear from, for example, physicians and health systems, private equity funds. For example, yesterday a physician called and said, does this mean I'm going to be able to get out of all my non-competes? And of course, the response was, we don't know. We don't know what this means. But are you starting to hear from the private equity community, the health system community about this, or is it still too early to, I guess if people are structuring deals right now, they're going to have to at least consider these things, but is it too early to, in terms of the FTC proposal and everything else, they have a lot of discussions around it? Are people, what is the sense? Are people starting to, because it seems like this is from a lawyer's perspective, this is a huge issue.
Right.
From a health system perspective, I've not yet heard that much outcry about it, and from the private equity community, probably more discussion about what does this mean for deals where we are used to having non-competes. What do you hear out there?
Yeah, I think from a legal perspective, we need to make sure our clients are aware, right? I mean, I think that's the number one, is if we are entering into a deal right now that has non-competes, right, we need to make sure that they're aware that, hey, worst case scenario, this could not be, this could be void under this new rule, right? So we want to put that on your radar. And I think just generally educating people and making sure people are aware is key for us right now, because like you just mentioned, it's a proposed rule. It's a big question mark. I mean, there's going to be huge pushback on this. There already is. I was reading something, the Chambers of Commerce came out and said, this is clearly void. We're going to sue over this. It's going to be a huge fight, right? So we'll see where it lands. But I do think it's something that executives, savvy business owners, PE funds, they should be aware of and be thinking about, okay, if this is going to happen in, 2 years, how are we thinking about ways that we're going to protect our business and protect our value? And like you said, it depends on which side you sit. If you're a physician, you may say, hey, this is great. I don't mind this at all. So, I mean, for the workers, it could be seen as a good thing, but for, founders and owners, et cetera, then not so much.
Well, and it also has the ability for founders and owners, if they can't, as part of a transaction, provide a non-compete. I mean, the original sentiment might, well, this is good if you're a founder owner, because you sell your business, you're going to have a non-compete. But it also may devalue your business, because if somebody can't have comfort that they are going to get a non-compete, they may not be willing to sell it to buy it for as much, because they're more concerned about you having a business, having a practice, whatever it might be, and then starting a new one because you're not bound by a non-compete. So the good news may be bad news in terms of valuation. Is that possible too?
Yeah, no, that's definitely possible. And I think for all the reasons you're pointing out, I mean, this really turns a lot of the analysis on its head, because there's such a critical part of these transactions and what you're paying for. Like you said, you need to be able to, you're paying a lot of times for that certainty. So yeah, absolutely.
Andrea, thank you so much. What a fascinating set of issues. And this will have real impacts on how people contract, how they do business, how they acquire things, if it actually turns out that you can't include non-competes. I know it's too early to tell, but what an interesting situation. Thank you so much for joining us on the Becker Private Equity Podcast, the Becker Business Minute Podcast. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.